The morning Delphine Voss called me from a number I didn't recognize. I was standing on my apartment balcony in Santa Monica watching a pelican drop out of the sky like a stone. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was different, smaller than I remembered, stripped of the performance she usually dressed it in. "Celeste," she said. "We need to talk." I had waited a long time for that sentence, though not in the way she imagined. Let me back up. I grew up in Garnet Falls, Indiana, a town so small it had one stoplight and a reputation for producing people who either stayed forever or left and never looked back. My family ran a breakfast diner called Greer's Corner on the main drag. The smell of griddle grease and hazelnut coffee was the smell of my whole childhood. My parents, Warren and June Greer, ran it with the kind of dignity that people who have never worked that hard tend to romanticize and people who have tend to recognize immediately. They didn't complain. They didn't explain. They just worked. I watched that and made a decision at 16 that I would not let them do it alone. College was a dream I folded up quietly and put somewhere safe. I told myself it wasn't gone, just postponed. I started studying Mandarin on my phone during slow shifts, then moved to Spanish, then to the hospitality software my parents used for catering orders. By 20, I had landed a job coordinating group travel packages for corporate clients in Indianapolis. By 24, I was running logistics for international conferences, hotel blocks, ground transport, translation services, everything. I had a skill for reading the invisible architecture of how large groups of people moved through unfamiliar spaces, and I was very good at making that architecture invisible. That's how I ended up in Detroit at the Harmon Grand, organizing a 3-day hospitality summit the winter I turned 28. The hotel was the kind of place where the lighting alone cost more than my parents' diner made in a month. I was checking translator assignments in the mezzanine lounge when a man named Remy Pelletier appeared beside me. "You've been staring at that binder for 40 minutes, he said. "Thought you could use a distraction." Remy was 31, worked hotel events coordination, and had a quality I would later understand was both his gift and his limitation. He absorbed the emotions of everyone around him. He was warm and funny and carried a low-grade sadness about his father's death that made him seem tender rather than wounded. We talked about my parents, about his mother Delphine, about what it meant to owe people your best years. We fell in love with the efficiency of two people who recognized something familiar in each other's exhaustion. He asked me to move into his family home in Grosse Pointe 8 months later. I said yes because I loved him and because I believed, sincerely and wrongly, that proximity to people makes them knowable. Delphine Voss was 64 and operated on the assumption that a woman who had once had money was still owed the lifestyle that came with it. Her late husband had left behind significant debt and a house that required constant maintenance, but she moved through her days as if none of that were true. She wore silk robes to breakfast and spoke about her social past with the reverence of someone describing sacred texts. She had a smile that appeared instantly and communicated nothing. The first time she asked where I had gone to university and I told her I hadn't, she said, "Oh, that's interesting," in a tone that meant the opposite. I noted it. I didn't correct it. I had a growing consulting business by then. I had taken my logistics expertise and built a platform that connected event planners with vetted local service vendors across 22 cities. The work was technical, demanding, and by that point, quietly profitable. I worked from the house most days, which Delphine interpreted as availability. She never asked what I was working on. She asked when the guest bathroom would be scrubbed, whether I could drive her to a gallery opening across the city, whether I had remembered to collect her dry cleaning. She asked these things with perfect courtesy, which was somehow worse than if she had been openly rude. I was not an enemy. I was furniture. Useful, expected to be present, not particularly interesting. Remy, when I told him, said his mother meant well. He said this the way people say the weather is unpredictable, as an explanation that explains nothing. Offered to close a conversation rather than open one. I kept working. My platform was attracting serious investors. I was on calls with people who had built and sold companies who spoke about scale and market penetration with a calm certainty that I was learning to mirror. And then I would hang up and Delphine would appear in the doorway to let me know the kitchen window needed wiping. The breaking point was not dramatic. It rarely is. She was hosting a small dinner and told me pleasantly that she had invited several friends who had known Remy since childhood. "They'll love meeting you," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "though I should mention, Marel will ask about your background. It might be easier if we keep it simple." I asked what she meant by simple. She smiled. "Just that you're in hospitality. No need to get into everything." I looked at her. I looked at Remy, who was adjusting his cufflinks and not looking at either of us. I understood then that I was not a partner in this household. I was a managed variable. The dinner itself was the public confrontation, though it didn't announce itself that way. One of Delphine's friends, a woman named Patrice, asked about my work with the warm aggression of someone who already knew the answer they wanted. I told her flatly and completely what I did. I named the platform, the cities, the contracts. Delphine said, smoothly, "Celeste is very entrepreneurial. The way you describe a child's art project." I said equally smoothly, "My current annual contract value is just over 4 million. It's not a hobby." The table went quiet. Remy's jaw moved slightly. Delphine's smile stayed perfectly in place. That night she called me a liability. She said Remy had given up a promotion to accommodate my lifestyle experiment. She said people from where I came from had a particular kind of ambition that looked like drive but was really just insecurity. She said all of this quietly in the kitchen, while Remy stood in the doorway and said nothing. I left the next morning. I want to be precise about this. I did not slam doors or deliver speeches. I packed 2 bags, put my laptop under my arm, and told Remy I was done. He asked me to wait. I said I had already waited long enough. The apartment I found in Ann Arbor had a radiator that knocked all night and a view of a parking structure, and I slept better in it than I had in months. I worked. I closed a funding round that valued the business at 12 million. Then 18. By my 30th birthday, by every external measure I had been told I was failing to meet, I had built something worth $20 million, and my parents flew out to visit me in the house I had purchased outright in Santa Monica, which smelled like salt air and had a lemon tree in the backyard. My mother stood in the kitchen and cried a little and said she didn't know where I had gotten this from. And I told her I had watched her do it every day for 18 years. Then came the morning Delphine called. I had, until that call, not fully understood how much of their life I had quietly subsidized. The utilities, the maintenance contracts on the house, the grocery deliveries, Remy arranged through an account linked to a card I had added him to. None of it dramatic. All of it continuous. They had not noticed it leaving because they had not noticed it arriving. She told me about the collection notices, the suspended accounts, the heating system that needed replacement. Her voice had a quality it had never carried before, uncertainty. She was asking, though she could not quite make herself say the word ask. I told her I understood the situation. I told her I was sorry she was in it. I told her I would not be resolving it for her. Remy got on the line. He said I had obligations. I told him the word he was looking for was choices, and that we had both made them and that mine had stopped including him on the morning. He called me ungrateful. I found I had nothing useful to say to that. The divorce was quiet. He looked diminished in a way that I did not find satisfying and did not pretend to. I told him, because I meant it, that the path out was the same one I had taken. Start smaller than. He nodded like a man who had just been handed a map to a country he had never considered visiting. My parents stayed 3 weeks. My friend Ren Calloway, who I had known since we were 9 years old in Garnet Falls, flew out twice that year, and brought her partner, and we grilled on the back patio and talked about where we thought we would be at this age, when we were 17, and how wrong we had been, and how that wrongness had been in the end the better outcome. I still think about the girl who sat in the back of her parents' diner, learning logistics software on a second-hand tablet because she wanted to make something lighter for the people who had made something possible for her. She was not naive. She was just beginning. There is a version of this story where I am defined by what Delphine said about me, where her assessment of my worth becomes the organizing fact of my life. I chose a different version. Not because I am exceptional, but because I had been watching people do hard things with grace since before I could name what grace was. So let me ask you something honest. If someone had spent years quietly making your life possible while you mistook their competence for simplicity, when you finally understood what you had been taking for granted, what would you have done with that knowledge?